Weight stigma is bias and discrimination aimed at overweight people based on a series of social attitudes that people develop that can start very early in life that assume that there's something wrong with overweight people and that they should be punished for their condition.
When we talk about weight bias, we are generally referring to negative attitudes towards individuals who are overweight or obese. And negative weight-based stereotypes are very prevalent in our society, and they often lead to stigma, rejection, prejudice, and discrimination. And like other forms of stigma, weight bias occurs in multiple forms. It can occur in the form of verbal derogatory comments, physical aggression, something called relational victimization, which involves being ignored or excluded, and even cyberbullying. So it's important to recognize that weight bias has both subtle and overt forms. Weight bias is a significant priority in our society because millions of children and adults are affected by stigma and prejudice, and this leads to very serious psychological consequences, as well as pervasive social and economic inequalities, adverse effects on physical health, and overall reduces quality of life for those who are affected. So when we consider the consequences of weight bias for both children and adults, we see a range of social, psychological, and physical health consequences. First of all, when we look at social and economic consequences, we see that those who are stigmatized about their weight face tremendous social rejection and less peer acceptance. They also report lower quality in the relationships that they have. For children and adolescents, we also see that weight-based teasing at school leads to worse academic performance and avoidance of school. And among adults, we see that this leads to inequitable hiring practices, lower wages, and prejudice from employers. Specifically, when we look more closely at academic consequences, we see that among adolescents who are teased because of their weight, they report that their grades are harmed because of weight-based teasing and bullying, and they also report avoiding school in order to escape weight-based bullying. We found in our research that the odds of students reporting these consequences increased by 5% per teasing incident, even after we accounted for things like gender, age, race, their grades, and their weight status. When we consider psychological consequences, weight bias increases risk for a range of different psychological problems, including higher risk of depression and anxiety, low self-esteem, poor body image, and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. The suicidality is especially concerning for youth who are teased about their weight. Some research has found that these children are 2 to 3 times more likely to be engaging in suicidal thoughts and behaviors compared to their overweight peers who are not being teased. There are also significant consequences of weight bias for eating behaviors. When children and adults are stigmatized because of their weight, they are much more likely to engage in chronic dieting, unhealthy weight control practices, eating disorders and binge eating behaviors, increased food consumption, and a higher dropout rate from weight loss programs and less weight loss. This is really important to highlight because there tends to be a public perception that maybe stigma is not such a bad thing, that maybe it will motivate or provide incentive for people to lose weight. But what we see here from this research and from other studies is that the opposite is true, that weight-based teasing and bullying and discrimination lead to behaviors that instead can impair weight loss efforts and reinforce obesity. Similarly, we see that when those are teased about their weight or stigmatized about their weight, they are more likely to avoid physical activity. This is especially true for children in physical activity settings like gym class. And there are also studies now showing that weight bias increases risk of cardiovascular health problems like high blood pressure and increased cortisol reactivity. And finally, studies also show that when patients experience weight bias in the healthcare setting, they are more likely to avoid future healthcare appointments because of those experiences of bias.
I was actually born to be fat. My excess weight is caused by 2 conditions. The first one is lipedema. Lipedema is the abnormal accumulation of adipose tissue, fat. And this adipose tissue accumulates in the legs, hips, thighs, sometimes upper arms. It's a congenital condition that actually affects 11% of women, but it's usually mistaken for obesity and goes undiagnosed. Lipedema occurs in stages, and the advanced stages, including The advanced stages including lymphedema. Basically, the lipedema fat begins to crush the lymphatic system. Now, lymphedema is the abnormal accumulation of lymph fluid. Signs of lipedema are actually evident in pictures of me as a child, yet I wasn't diagnosed until I was in my 20s, and by that time my weight had soared to over 500 pounds. Had I been diagnosed at an earlier age, I could have gotten treatment sooner. Had my doctors not been engaging in weight bias my entire childhood, I might be telling a very different story today, or I might not be here at all. Obesity is defined as a body mass index greater than 30. And despite my obesity being due to lipedema and lymphedema, I am and will forever be categorized as having obesity. Now, before I go any further, there's a lot of debate about whether or not obesity is a disease or due to poor lifestyle choices. Whether or not, I could give a whole speech on that, but there are facts that are not debatable and that impact everyone. Obesity is an epidemic that affects 1/3 of American adults. Obesity accounts for 21% of overall US healthcare expenditures. Businesses lose $4.3 billion every year in obesity-related absenteeism. And despite all the money being spent fighting the war on obesity, obesity rates continue to rise. So why is this happening? I believe it's in part due to the fact that society and healthcare providers are blinded by bias. Instead of judging us, help us. The focus needs to be on the individual patient, not awareness. We know we're fat. We've been told we're fat our entire lives. Do something to help us improve our health. 15 years ago, April, the year 2000, I went to the doctor seeking help for my legs. As you can see, they were abnormally large and they leaked lymph fluid. I was scared. I nearly lost my mobility and was housebound, almost housebound. The doctor told me the problem was just my weight. She knew the problem was just my weight, yet she didn't know how much I weighed. The scale in her office didn't have a high enough capacity to weigh me. According to the Rudd Center, only 1 in 11 physician offices have a scale with a capacity beyond 300 pounds. Imagine stepping onto the scale and hearing that clank and watching the nurse slide the weights all the way over and nothing happens. Imagine how frustrating it's to be told to lose weight and not having a starting point to monitor or gauge any progress. I so desperately wanted to know my weight, I went to a junkyard to weigh myself. Now, in one of the richest countries in the world, a country that spends nearly $3 trillion on healthcare, and I had to resort to a junkyard to get vital medical information. That's weight bias. And it's not just a lack of scales. There's also a lack of seating and larger gowns and equipment. I often find that doctors' offices can't properly take my blood pressure. Either they don't have a large cuff or the staff aren't trained to take a manual reading on my arms. Weight and blood pressure are two basic yet very important vital signs, yet I go without having them documented or monitored or documented properly. Now, on a positive note,